All right, can you see my screen?
Sure can, although it's in presenter's view.
Here, let me unplug the second monitor and it should hopefully, there we go. Is that good?
That's great.
All right. So the first three sessions have been a prelude really to this session where I hope a lot of ideas will be coming together. And starting with this session, I'm going to be relying much more explicitly and deeply on the small volume, The Call of the Divine Beloved. We might regard as the textbook of Baha'i mysticism, the summation of much of Baha'u'llah's writings on, but certainly not all of them, a good chunk of Baha'u'llah's writings on mystical topics, including the revised translations of the Seven Valleys and the Four Valleys are found here, plus several additional mystical works also in this volume, which, as we will see in the next session or two, provide absolutely invaluable light on the nature of the mystical path and the relationship between what we might call the valleys or the cities that Baha'u'llah describes. So just briefly to recap where we've been and where we've gone up until this point. In the first session, we began by asking what is mysticism, what is it not, and coming to some provisional conclusions about it not necessarily being about the pursuit of an experience of a particular kind, but certainly not excluding the existence of an existence of a particular kind, or experiences in the multiple, as perhaps the mystical path comprises a series of stages at which there are successive openings of consciousness into greater realities, each of which may be attended by its own particular kind of experience, as we see Baha'u'llah described very explicitly in the Seven Valleys. Sessions 2 and 3 introduce two major topics, the two central topics of any religion, arguably, God and the soul, and explored both of those topics from the perspective of their innate polarity, which one finds throughout the religious experience of the human race. The idea of the divine, sometimes seen as out there, as separate from us, as above us, as beyond us, and sometimes seen as within all things, as submerged beneath all things, as being that light shining within all things. In other words, dualistic and non-dualistic conceptions of the divinity are the two primary categories with which humanity has historically addressed these questions of ultimate significance. And in parallel, those who have approached the human soul and tried to understand the nature of the soul have similarly seen it sometimes in dualistic categories as something comprised of some substance other than the material substance of the body. In other words, a dualistic conception, which in Western philosophy, for example, René Descartes was very famous for codifying within this conception of the dualistic view of the human spirit. As in the dualistic conception of God, there comes naturally the idea of rationally proving the existence of the thing because it's conceived as something which is separate from, it's conceived in the category of an object about which one can formulate questions such as, does it exist and what's its relationship to me? Similarly, however, with the soul, there's a second way of looking at the nature of the soul, which is non-dualistic, which doesn't see the soul as fundamentally separate from the rest of creation or from God, but rather sees the soul and the consciousness that it embodies as something which is surging within every atom, something which perhaps temporarily while we live in these earthly shells, might give us the illusion of separateness from one another. But as the veils ultimately are parted, whether in this life or upon one's death, that illusion of separateness ultimately dissolves, and one finds a more monistic conception of the soul. So in relating these two opposed, polarized, opposite ways of conceiving of both God and the human soul, and parenthetically, I think I mentioned before, Baha'u'llah talks about God and the soul as being the two great mysteries that will never be understood, and the confession of our helplessness at understanding these things as marks really the high watermark of humanity's spiritual development. So here we are, nevertheless, trying to penetrate something which we're assured has no bottom to it, but continue we must. So the fact that there are these polar opposite ways of thinking about God and the soul can lead naturally to the question, well, why is this the case? Is it simply the case that that half the people on the planet throughout history have simply been completely wrong? That one of these two poles is the right way to look at it? In the end, if you collect all the available information and have all the right experiences, you'll conclude, oh, God is actually a being out there that can be proven. Or you'll conclude, well, actually, God was never a being out there in the first place. God was always within. Is it a matter of one of these sides winning in the end? Or is there something deeper going on behind the existence of these pluralities? And this is where I think we come into where we start intersecting with the notion of the spiritual path as unfolded in the mystics throughout history, as well as in the tablets in the Call of the Divine Beloved, which we're going to be starting to look at in detail. Perhaps, as I believe Baha'u'llah offers us a solution in a way, a solution to one of the most fundamental problems of humanity, which is the problem of our own disunity. One can look at the existence of these polar opposites as stages in a path, and you start at one when you're, say, a child, and you end on the other when you're an adult. Or you can look at these two different ways of being in relationship to these matters of ultimate significance as simply a matter of being different kinds of spiritual types, which are a feature of human existence, which there will always be in any human population, those who tend to look at God through the lens of the transcendent and those who tend to look at God through the lens of the immanent, and similarly with the human soul. It's not a problem, it's not a theological problem to be resolved by the imposition of the correct doctrine. It's rather a matter of recognizing that there are different lenses through which we can perceive reality, and that each of these lenses is valid within its own perspective. And if we approach these mystical and theological matters with that sort of lens, that gives us a way to approach the pragmatic goal of the Baha'i faith. So we're swinging from the sort of the mystical depths of things to the very pragmatic purpose of the faith, which is bringing the human race together on this planet in a way that we can move forward collectively to advance human civilization and really save our planet. And if we're going to do that, we have to find a way to reconcile differences which may seem to be completely irreconcilable within the framework of any past religious or theological doctrine. And the framework that Baha'u'llah gives us is this framework of which Baha'is call the relativity of religious truth. One manifestation of which is progressive revelation, the fact that different religious communities appear at different times and different places on the planet in response to the particular spiritual receptivities and spiritual needs of the age, progressive revelation. But also the principle of the relativity of religious truth is something which, if you think of it in time as being like the vertical axis, then the principle of the relativity of religious truth extends also into the horizontal axis, in the sense that at any particular snapshot in time and place, in any particular population of human beings, even if they share the same cultural background, there will be different spiritual types. There will be people who approach the world in different ways, will tend to look at things very analytically. Other people will tend to look at things very intuitively. This is as we understand human nature. Baha'u'llah provides a theological framework for the acceptance of these kinds of theological viewpoints, which in the past were the cause of great conflict, war, and the death of many people. So one question that has to, I suppose, that this begs is, well, if we're going to put this question of the polarity of ways of looking at God and looking at the soul in the context of a spiritual path, well, one of them has to go in front of the other. So doesn't that mean that one of them is more advanced than the other? Doesn't that mean that those, from the perspective of one path, are always going to be kind of looking down on people from the other, who are to their eyes at a valley below them? We share this more exalted, more subtle, more spiritual way of looking at the world. And yes, your way of looking at it is also its own relative truth, but that's like the truth of a first grader. That's the truth of someone at a lower stage. And I think one has to devoutly shake off that temptation. Baha'u'llah actually, in the end of Gems of Divine Mysteries, which is in what one might call the companion volume to Call the Divine Beloved, around the same size and shape and color and everything. At the end of Gems of Divine Mysteries, which gives very much a parallel version of the seven valleys, Baha'u'llah says that if the seeker, having attained all of these valleys, if there should enter into that seeker's heart the least trace of pride and vainglory, they will be returned to the very first valley of the search without realizing it. So there's always this danger of pride in understanding where one's spiritual station is. One can think of it as like the egg and the chick. If you're the chick, you might think, well, the egg is there for my sake, and the whole purpose of eggs is just making more chicks. But if you're the egg, you can always think about it from the other perspective. You can say, well, the purpose of a chick is to produce more eggs. It's a matter of perspective, and it's also a matter of perspective. Well, is the chick better than the egg? These are just two different stages, equally good in the sort of most universal cosmic sense of things, because they're all part of the perfection of creation. I think also already mentioned this quotation in an earlier session. It's worth revisiting in Call of the Divine Beloved, from the letter B to the letter H. And this is where Baha'u'llah gives, probably more explicitly than he has elsewhere, this principle of diversity of spiritual belief being an ineradicable feature of the human condition. He says, but since all do not possess the same degree of spiritual understanding, certain statements will inevitably be made, and there shall arise as a consequence as many differing opinions as there are human minds, and as many divergent beliefs as there are created things. This is certain and settled and can in no wise be averted. Now it is clear that some are virtuous, others are sinful, still others are rebellious. One must call the people to love and faithfulness, to zeal and contentment, that the sinful may be admonished and the ranks of the virtuous may swell. Nor is it possible that there be no sinners. So long as the name, the ever-forgiving, shineth resplendent above the horizon of existence, there will be sinners in the world of creation, and for the latter cannot appear without the former, and the former cannot exist without the latter. And I might add parenthetically, who's a sinner and who's a saint is also a matter of perspective. Our aim is that thou shouldst urge all the believers to show forth kindness and mercy, and to overlook certain shortcomings among them, that differences may be dispelled, true harmony be established, and the censure and reproach, the hatred and dissension seen among the peoples of former times may not arise anew. So central to Baha'u'llah's message then is giving us the theological tool set with which humanity can go forward in a united front. And that has to be some reconfiguration of our thinking about what religious truth is. We can no longer think about, oh, this person is a true believer and this person is just following a bunch of falsehoods. One has to see things within their own perspective and to embrace all the validity that these different perspectives contain. Baha'u'llah says something very similar, this time in the Seven Valleys, which one can identify as the central mystical text that Baha'u'llah wrote in the Baghdad period. And this is from the Valley of Knowledge. He says, "It is known to thine eminence that all the variations which the wayfarer in the stages of his journey beholdeth in the realms of being proceed from his own vision. We shall give an example of this, that the meaning may become fully clear. Consider the visible sun, although it shineth with the same radiance upon all existence, and at the behest of the Lord of revelation bestoweth light on all things, yet in each place it becometh manifest and sheddeth its bounty according to the potentialities of that place. For instance, in a mirror it reflecteth its own disk in shape, and this is due to the clarity of the mirror itself. Through a crystal it maketh fire to appear, and in other things it showeth only the effect of its shining, but not its full disk. And yet, through that effect, by the command of the Creator, it traineth each thing according to the capacity of that thing, even as thou dost observe. In sum, the differences among objects have now been made plain. Thus, when the wayfarer gazeth only upon the place of appearance, that is, when he considereth only the glass, he seeth yellow and red and white. And so it is that conflict hath prevailed amongst men, and a darksome dust from limited souls hath settled over the world. Others gaze upon the effulgence of the light, while yet others have drunk of the wine of oneness and see naught but the sun itself." So this will lead me to offer to you as one person's attempt to try to correlate and coordinate the different mystical stages that Baha'u'llah describes in his various tablets in one plan, kind of a skeleton key for the mystical path, which in largest outlines incorporates what we talked about in the last two sessions, the idea of dualism, whether with regard to God or the human soul, as being the initial set of stages, and then seeing through the eye of unity, or in a non-dualistic way, as comprising the next set of stages. And then finally, there being a stage or stages beyond both dualism and non-dualism. And we'll see how these three basic stages in the mystical path break down, both in Baha'u'llah's Seven Valleys and in his other mystical works. I also just, kind of for fun, but because I really enjoyed this quote by Will and Ariel Durant, who wrote in the middle of the last century this great series on world history. They're one of the most productive couples, married authors, I think, that we know of. And they had, I think, something I find very insightful about the nature of the spiritual path. And they put it in this way. They said, in religion, the mature mind has passed through three stages: belief, unbelief, and understanding. And I will further correlate these three stages to the mystic path. It immediately might make one ask, well, why does belief come before unbelief in their three stages? Why doesn't it go unbelief and then belief and then understanding? Anyway, that resolution of that will be, I think, left as an exercise to the reader. So this is the slide which will essentially foreshadow what we'll be talking about in this section, in this session and the following session. So this is the kind of summary of what we're about to do. As I mentioned, it is broadly conceived in three stages. The stage which we might call the eye of distinction, what Baha'u'llah calls valleys of limitation in the seven valleys. And this is where dualistic conceptions are in the forefront. That's followed by the eye of unity, or the valleys of unity, also as Baha'u'llah calls them, in the seven valleys. And this is where non-dualism is in the forefront. But it doesn't stop there, and beyond these valleys, and even beyond the conception of thinking about spiritual progress in terms of stages or valleys or cities, is something that Baha'u'llah says is transcended at some point. So there comes a stage beyond dualism and non-dualism itself. So let us dive in with the first of these. You'll notice, although Baha'u'llah talks about seven valleys in his Gems of Divine Mysteries, he removes one valley but adds two more. So it's kind of 8 valleys. Also in the seven valleys, he implies that there's a valley before the first valley, which we may have already heard of, the Valley of Search. That's why I have Valley 0 as being a part of this, because I think we have to acknowledge at the beginning that if we're going to provide the most complete possible typology of seekers along the spectrum of the mystic quest, we have to acknowledge that most people are not even in the Valley of Search. Although the seven valleys begins with the Valley of Search, one has to be aware that one is searching and be launched upon that journey. Whereas it's probably the case that most of humanity is not actively in a state of search. One could call it the Valley of the Blissfully Ignorant. Baha'u'llah refers to it in Seven Valleys, paragraph 42. He says, "For there are some who dwell in the plane of divine unity and speak of that world, and some inhabit the realms of limitation." These are the first 3 valleys. "And some the grades of self, while others are completely veiled." So it's so he's kind of making a gesture in the direction of groups of people who are not in his in this typology of the seven valleys. So the Valley of Search, which begins things. And before I go through the Valley of Search, let me just say briefly that and kind of foreshadow, because it's going to get into the weeds a bit, and I want to have said it first before I say it again, and then say it a third time at the end, like you're supposed to do. That one can think of the mystic quest as having to do with how the seeker comprehends opposites. In other words, the dualism that we are faced with in the world, the existence of opposites, hot and cold, good and bad, hunger and satiety, and everything else, is the feature of the world into which we're thrust. And the mystic path can be seen as progressively encompassing the idea of the discovery of these great opposites, the sort of living in the tension and the pain of those opposites, of reconciling them, and seeing one as being in the other, and the other as being in the first. But then beyond that is the unity of opposites. So instead of seeing the end in the beginning, you see the end and the beginning as one. So it's sort of one step beyond simply reconciling opposites, is unifying opposites. But beyond that is the annihilation of opposites, in which one no longer even sees ends and beginnings at all, but one flees from all that is first and runs away from all that is last, as Baha'u'llah again says in the Seven Valleys. So that's to foreshadow what we're going to be looking at in these slides to come, which will only, I think, let's see what time it is. We'll only get to do a couple of these valleys, I think, and we'll be finishing up, hopefully finishing it up the next time. So in the Valley of Search, the first valley, Baha'u'llah talks about what its prerequisites are. First of all, it's purity of heart. And second of all, it's being patient in the search. Baha'u'llah talks about purity of heart in a number of places, the centrality of purity of heart in the seeker's quest. Perhaps most significantly, not even in the Seven Valleys, but in the Kitab-i-Iqan, in the section in towards the middle of part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan, where he talks about the spiritual prerequisites of the true seeker. And this is where he says, when a true seeker determineth to take the step of search in the path leading to the knowledge of the Ancient of Days, he must before all else cleanse and purify his heart. And it goes on in such a beautiful vein in those terms. I'm truncating all of these quotations rather violently, and for that I apologize. And hopefully this is enough for you to pursue it on your own and find the full context of these. Otherwise, these slides are just going to get too messy. In the Seven Valleys, where he talks about the Valley of Search, he says it is incumbent upon these servants to cleanse the heart, which is the wellspring of divine treasures of every marking. And in Gems of Divine Mysteries, also in the Valley of Search, he says he must sanctify his soul from the veils of glory. And of course, we can't forget the first hidden word, to possess a pure, kindly, and radiant heart, that thou may be a sovereignty, ancient, imperishable, and everlasting. And one might give as the second great prerequisite of the Valley of Search is this quality of patience. Baha'u'llah names the steed of the Valley of Search as patience. And he says that one should be willing to search for 100,000 years and still not reach and not discover the beloved, and should not flag in the search by one iota. But at the end of this, or actually, during the course of this valley, one becomes introduced to the opposites. One becomes introduced to the existence of the opposites. In Gems of Divine Mysteries, for example, he says, in this journey, the garden of search, the seeker becometh witness to a myriad changes and transformations, confluences, and divergences. They see the tensions. They see, and in the context of Gems of Divine Mysteries, Baha'u'llah is talking about how at this early stage in the mystic journey, one sees the prophets of God as being separate from each other, as preaching different messages, incompatible messages. And it's only in a later stage in the mystic quest that one understands the unity behind all of their messages. So when one transcends this first valley, where one receives the first intimation of the existence of these profound dualities, one lives and experiences and is submerged in the tension of them. Baha'u'llah calls the valley of, and this is the valley of love. One discovers the beloved, and one is thrust into a world of pain. The steed of this valley is pain, Baha'u'llah says. The pain is beautifully described in the Seven Valleys. I can't quote all of it here. The seeker loses their reason. They become kind of mad in a way, insane. Baha'u'llah says the Leviathan of love swalloweth the master of reason and slayeth the Lord of knowledge. In Gems of Divine Mysteries, in the same valley, he says, in this station, the seeker is so overcome by the ecstasies of yearning and the fragrances of longing that he discerneth not his left from his right, nor doth he distinguish land from sea or desert from ocean. And part of the pain of this, the real, let's say, philosophical reason or for the pain, is that the seeker in this stage, although having met the beloved and fallen in love, still the lover is the object. And because the lover is the object of the affection and yearning of the beloved, it's forever separate. And it's that separateness of the object from the subject, which is the cause of the pain. And that separateness of subject and object, which is a feature of the values of limitation, is what the seeker has to overcome in the stages to come. This inability to reconcile opposites, the inability to see, for instance, the vicissitudes of life as being actual guidance, to see how in all of the tests and difficulties that we experience, there's some grace involved. And that idea is beautifully expressed in the story of the watchman in the third valley. And Baha'u'llah describes a lover who's pining away for his beloved, wandering the streets listlessly, distractedly, when a watchman comes along and starts chasing him. And he runs away from the watchman and laments the state that he's being pursued by the watchman, and he comes to a wall and he jumps over it. And in the end, he finds the beloved. But what Baha'u'llah says about this state of being pursued by the watchman, he says, if the lover could have seen the end, he would from the beginning have blessed the watchman, because the watchman chased him to the wall, which he had to jump over in order to find the beloved. But since the end was veiled to him, he lamented and made his plaint in the beginning. Such is the state of the wayfarers of this valley. So that's sort of summary of the valley of love in relationship to this idea of duality and non-duality. So the valley of love is like where the duality of existence is most intensely felt, and it's that yearning of the beloved for the lover for the beloved. So as we know what happens next, the lover jumps over the wall and recognizes, finally meets with the beloved. And this is his reason is restored to him, and certitude is attained. So this is described in the Kitab-i-Iqan as attaining the city of certitude. This is the state of knowledge and understanding. Baha'u'llah describes it so beautifully again in the Kitab-i-Iqan. Only when the lamp of search, and notice how he describes having to go through the valley of search in the valley of love to get to the valley of knowledge. Only when the lamp of search, of earnest striving, of longing desire, of passionate devotion, of fervid love, of rapture and ecstasy is kindled within the seeker's heart, and the breeze of his loving kindness is wafted upon his soul, will the darkness of error be dispelled, the mist of doubt and misgivings be dissipated, and the lights of knowledge and certitude envelop his being. And in the Seven Valleys, he describes it, that same moment, that same stage of mystical insight as, and if confirmed by the Creator, the lover escapeth the claws of the eagle of love, he will enter the realm of knowledge and come out of doubt into certitude, and turn from the darkness of wayward desire to the guiding light of the fear of God. And again, the philosophical interpretation of this, excuse me, is that this is where for the first time, the seeker is able to see the end in the beginning. So, and this is where I think it passes beyond the ability of the watchman and the story of the watchman and the lover to really capture it. All of these metaphors have a certain value you can extract from them, and then you have to move on to the next metaphor. But as Baha'u'llah puts it again in the Seven Valleys, he said, such is the state of the wayfarers in this valley. He's talking about love. But the people of the valleys of the valleys above this, the next one being knowledge, see the end and the beginning as one. And so this is where we move to the next valley. So they've been able to reconcile opposites when they reach the valley of knowledge. And that reconciliation of opposites dissolves the pain of that unrequited love, the divine love, which is never requited because subject and object are forever separate. And this first intimation of the deeper unity behind things is in this valley of knowledge, in which one sees the end in the beginning. That's where Baha'u'llah is referring to the watchman here, and the story. He said, if you could just see the end in the beginning, he wouldn't have lamented along this journey. And that's equivalent to being in the valley of knowledge. But here's the point. The valley of knowledge is still, according to Baha'u'llah, one of the valleys of limitation. So what makes this a valley of limitation? It seems like a pretty advanced spiritual state up to this point. You've gone through searching for something and finding it but not realizing, then realizing that actually the end is in the beginning. I mean, it sounds like a pretty like you kind of made it. But Baha'u'llah says, no, this is actually still one of the valleys of limitation, because even in the valley of knowledge, even though one sees the end in the beginning, one still conceives of them as two separate things. And only when one reaches the next stage of the mystical journey, the valley of unity, does one not just see the end in the beginning, but they see the end and the beginning as in fact the same thing. And this is how Baha'u'llah puts it in the Seven Valleys. Again, in re-quoting from the story of the watchman, he says, such is the state of the wayfarers in this valley, valley of love, but the people of the valleys above this, the first one being knowledge, see the end and the beginning as one. Nay, they, and now he's talking about the valley of unity, see neither beginning nor end and witness neither first nor last. And as we'll see, he goes on in this quotation to describe an even further valley. He sometimes does this. He'll take in one paragraph, he'll compress several valleys, and each sentence successively gives you a sort of a larger opening of spiritual insight into that final union beyond union, which comes at the end. Later on, just a few paragraphs down in the Seven Valleys, he says, after passing through the valley of knowledge, which is the last stage of limitation, so this is Baha'u'llah himself saying this is the station of limitation, the wayfarer cometh to the first station of unity and drinketh from the cup of oneness and gazeth upon the manifestations of singleness. In this station he pierceth the veils of plurality, fleeth the realms of the flesh, and ascendeth unto the heaven of unity. Just as an aside, this is one place where the Revised Translation has really improved upon the older translation of the Seven Valleys, because in the older translation, it says the wayfarer cometh unto the valley of unity. But a more precise translation is the wayfarer cometh to the first station of unity. Baha'u'llah is not saying the valley of unity is the only time unity is relevant to the spiritual quest. He's basically saying from the valley of unity forward, you can see that whole sort of the rest of it, valleys 4 and beyond, as being different stages in the unfoldment of the principle of unity. And it's primarily on the basis of this quotation that I'm suggesting this kind of skeleton key to the Seven Valleys, which is really based on what Baha'u'llah himself says, that there's valleys of limitation up to including the valley of knowledge, the third valley. And then the fourth valley and beyond are valleys of unity, different degrees of unity, different and more subtle and abstract understandings of unity. And then finally, one transcends, one sort of escapes the whole framework of valleys at the end, as we'll see. Okay, so I think that's enough. That's 7:15, so that's enough for this time. Next time we'll be looking at stages 5 and beyond, and hopefully there's a bit of time left for questions and reactions. I had it. Oh, I see. Yeah, Anya.
Anya, you're muted.
Thanks. I turned my video on, but yeah. I hope you're feeling better from COVID.
Yeah, thanks.
So much. Yeah, so I have a question from the beginning. You talked about pride at one's own like accomplishment at having reached a certain valley. And okay, so but what's the difference between pride versus understanding your station and your capacity for service?
That's a great question. The Buddhist would say, when you go out and on this quest for enlightenment and you find enlightenment, pride would be taking that enlightenment and like running with it and kind of staying above the affairs of the human race. But the true enlightened one becomes the bodhisattva, and they return into the world and they do good works and they humbly serve, shoulder to shoulder with everybody else, and they don't hold themselves above anyone else. Does that mean that they forget that they've achieved the enlightenment of the Buddha? Do they no longer see themselves as having attained some degree of spiritual insight? And if they do, how do they keep that in their heads at one and the same time with the utter humility that is required of service to others? If you can answer that, then I would be grateful. It's a tough question. I think it's one of the hardest spiritual questions for me. How do you not delude yourself? And I think part of it is this warning that Baha'u'llah gives that, historically, those who rise to the greatest heights, fall the furthest. I mean, it's a byword, but it's true in the physical world, and how much more in the spiritual realm. Look at the spiritual history of the faith and of Christianity and of all the great religions. Those oftentimes who are the closest to the founders were those whose betrayal of them caused the most damage and was the most keenly felt. And so perhaps it's just the knowledge of the intrinsic dangers of the higher you go that keeps one from those from the dangers of pride. But I would love to hear other thoughts about this.
Thanks so much, Stephen. That's really helpful.
No one has any thoughts to share on that point. I had a question about the slide that's up right now.
Yeah.
And just this, the Valleys 8+, is that something that's been mentioned by Baha'u'llah, or
Yes.
mentioned at the end of the presentation? We might just transcend the whole framework of valleys.
Yes. So I haven't yet shown you any scriptural evidence that this is the case, but it is coming. Lots of it.
Okay.
But I mean, you be the judge in the end whether I'm correct even in numbering it. I mean, because the whole idea of going beyond the 7 valleys is you reach a point kind of beyond the conception of valleys. So, assigning it a number is a little bit against the spirit of that. But when you're writing a skeleton key, you got to you still have to order stages and kind of write them down. So that's why I said 8+, because I didn't want to confine it, numerically at that point. Baha'u'llah talks about all the worlds of God. He doesn't confine it either to there being some finite degrees of comprehension. And it would be rather hubristic of us humans on this planet to also imagine that, by the accident of our evolution, from the savannah a couple million years ago in the middle of Africa to where we are now, that our minds have somehow attained the highest possible degree of understanding of the universe. And who's to say there aren't living conscious beings elsewhere in the universe whose understanding of things so far outstrips ours that that our highest flights of imagination are like those of ants to them.
Yeah, it's fun to play with those ideas and
Yeah,
imagine
Yeah.
it. Thank you.
so the fun part is to come, because we haven't yet come to unbelief. So what I've labeled as unbelief 2 in the Durantian, let's say Durantian staging of things, you know. They never mention there's like the unbelief that precedes belief, but that's more of a, that's a kind of, everyone gets that before you reach the station of belief, you know, you don't believe. But the kind of the interesting twist is from belief to unbelief through to understanding. And that twist, I think we're going to find, those in the values of wonderment and the values of contentment and wonderment in the 7 Valleys and elsewhere. Everything has to be undone and unbuilt before it can be rebuilt. And when it's rebuilt, it's on a different foundation. And that's where it gets, yeah, that's where I think it really gets interesting. And that's also where it gets more tentative on my part. All right. If there aren't any more questions, we'll just sign off for tonight and look forward to the next bunch of valleys in 2 weeks.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
All right. See you all
Thank you
later.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.